Chapter 21 of The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 21 Ben Weatherstaff. One of the strange things about living in the world is that it is only now and then one is quite sure one is going to live for ever and ever. One knows it sometimes when one gets up at the tender solemn dawn time and goes out and stands alone and throws one's head far back and looks up and watches the pale sky slowly changing and flushing and marvelous unknown things happening until the east almost makes one cry out and one's heart stands still at the strange unchanging majesty of the rising of the sun, which has been happening every morning for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. One knows it then for a moment or so. And one knows it sometimes when one stands by oneself in a wood at sunset, and the mysterious deep gold stillness slanting through and under the branches seems to be saying slowly again and again something one cannot quite hear, however much one tries. Then sometimes the immense quiet of the dark blue at night, with millions of stars waiting and watching, makes one sure. And sometimes the sound of far-off music makes it true, and sometimes a look in someone's eyes. And it was like that with Colin when he first saw and heard and felt the springtime inside the 4 high walls of a hidden garden. That afternoon the whole world seemed to devote itself to being perfect and radiantly beautiful and kind to one boy. Perhaps out of pure heavenly goodness the spring came and crowned everything it probably could into that one place. More than once Dickon paused in what he was doing and stood still, with a sort of growing wonder in his eyes, shaking his head softly. It is gradely," he said. "I'm 12 going on 13, and there's a lot of afternoons in 13 years, but seems to me like I never seen one as gradely as this here." "Aye, it is a gradely one," said Mary, and she sighed for mere joy. "I'll warrant it's the gradeliest one as ever was in the world." "Does tha think," said Colin with dreamy carefulness, "as happens it was made loike this here all o' purpose for me?" "My word!" cried Mary admiringly, "that there is a bit o' good Yorkshire. Tha'rt shaping first rate, that tha'rt." And delight reigned. They drew the chair under the plum tree, which was snowy white with blossoms and musical with bees. It was like a king's canopy, a fairy king's. There were flowering cherry trees near and apple trees whose buds were pink and white, and here and there one had burst open wide. Between the blossoming arches of the canopy bits of blue sky looked down like wonderful eyes. Mary and Dickon worked a little here and there, and Colin watched them. They brought him things to look at, buds which were opening, buds which were tight closed, bits of twig whose leaves were just showing green, the feather of a woodpecker which had dropped on the grass, the empty shell of some bird early hatched. Dickon pushed the chairs slowly round and round the garden, stopping every other moment to let him look at wonders springing out of the earth or trailing down from trees. It was like being taken in state round the country of a magic king and queen and shown all the mysterious riches it contained. "I wonder if we shall see the robin," said Colin. "Tha'll see him often enough after a bit," answered Dickon. "When the eggs hatches out the little chaps he'll be kept so busy it'll make his head swim. Tha'll see him flying backward and forward carrying worms nigh as big as himself, and that much noise going on the nest when he gets there as fair flusters him so as he scarce knows which big mouth to drop the first piece in, and gaping beaks and squawks on every side. Mother says as when she sees the work a robin has to keep them gaping beaks filled. She feels like she was a lady with nothing to do. She says she's seen the little chaps when it seems like the sweat must be dropping off them, though folk can't see it." This made them giggle so delightedly that they were obliged to cover their mouths with their hands, remembering that they must not be heard. Colin had been instructed as to the law of whispers and low voices several days before. He liked the mysteriousness of it, and did his best, but in the midst of excited enjoyment it is rather difficult never to laugh above a whisper. Every moment of the afternoon was full of new things, and every hour the sunshine grew more golden. The wheeled chair had been drawn back under the canopy, and Dickon had sat down on the grass and had just drawn out his pipe when Colin saw something he had not had time to notice before. "That's a very old tree over there, isn't it?" he said. Dickon looked across the grass at the tree, and Mary looked, and there was a brief moment of stillness. "Yes," answered Dickon after it, and his low voice had a very gentle sound. Mary gazed at the tree and thought. "The branches are quite gray, and there's not a single leaf anywhere," Colin went on. "It's quite dead, isn't it?" "Aye," admitted Dickon, "but them roses as climbs all over it will near hide every bit of the dead wood when they're full of leaves and flowers. It won't look dead then. It'll be the prettiest of all." Mary still gazed at the tree and thought. "It looks as if a big branch had been broken off," said Colin. "I wonder how it was done." "It's been done many a year," answered Dickon. With a sudden relieved start and laying his hand on Colin, "look at that robin. There he is. He's been foraging for his mate." Colin was almost too late, but he just caught sight of him, the flash of red-breasted bird with something in his beak. He darted through the greenness and into the close-grown corner and was out of sight. Colin leaned back on his cushion again, laughing a little. "He's taken her tea to her. Perhaps it's 5 o'clock. I think I'd like some tea myself." And so they were safe. "It was magic which sent the robin," said Mary secretly to Dickon afterward. "I know it was magic." For both she and Dickon had been afraid Colin might ask something about the tree whose branch had broken off 10 years ago, and they had talked it over together, and Dickon had stood and rubbed his head in a troubled way. "We mun look as if it wasn't no different from the other trees," he had said. "We couldn't never tell him how it broke, poor lad. If he says anything about it, we mun try to look cheerful." "Aye, that we mun," had answered Mary. But she had not felt as if she looked cheerful when she gazed at the tree. She wondered and wondered in those few moments if there was any reality in that other thing Dickon had said. He had gone on rubbing his rust-red hair in a puzzled way, but a nice comforted look had begun to grow in his blue eyes. "Mrs. Craven was a very lovely young lady," he had gone on rather hesitatingly, "and mother, she thinks maybe she's about Misselthwaite many a time looking after Mester Colin, same as all mothers do when they're took out of the world. They have to come back, thee sees. Happen she's been in the garden, and happen it was her set us to work and told us to bring him here." Mary had thought he meant something about magic. She was a great believer in magic. Secretly she quite believed that Dickon worked magic, of course good magic, on everything near him, and that was why people liked him so much and wild creatures knew he was their friend. She wondered indeed if it were not possible that his gift had brought the robin just at the right moment when Colin asked that dangerous question. She felt that his magic was working all the afternoon and making Colin look an entirely different boy. It did not seem possible that he could be the crazy creature who had screamed and beaten and bitten his pillow. Even his ivory whiteness seemed to change. The faint glow of colour which had shown on his face and neck and hands when he first got inside the garden really never quite died away. He looked as if he were made of flesh instead of ivory or wax. They saw the robin carry food to his mate 2 or 3 times, and it was so suggestive of afternoon tea that Colin felt they must have some. "Go and make one of the men servants bring some in a basket to the rhododendron walk," he said, "and then you and Dickon can bring it here." It was an agreeable idea, easily carried out, and when the white cloth was spread upon the grass with hot tea and buttered toast and crumpets, a delightfully hungry meal was eaten, and several birds on domestic errands paused to inquire what was going on, and were led into investigating crumbs with great activity. Nut and Shell whisked up trees with pieces of cake, and Soot took the entire half of a buttered crumpet into a corner and pecked at and examined and turned it over and made hoarse remarks about it until he decided to swallow it joyfully in one gulp. The afternoon was dragging toward its mellow hour. The sun was deepening the gold of its lances. The bees were going home and the birds were flying past less often. Dickon and Mary were sitting on the grass, the tea basket was repacked ready to be taken home to the house, and Colin was lying against his cushions with his heavy locks pushed back from his forehead and his face looking quite a natural colour. "I don't want this afternoon to go," he said, "but I shall come back tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after, and the day after." "You'll get plenty of fresh air, won't you?" said Mary. "I'm going to get nothing else," he answered. "I have seen the spring now, and I'm going to see the summer. I'm going to see everything grow here. I'm going to grow here myself." "That thou will," said Dickon. "Us'll have thee walking about here and digging same as us other folk afore long." Colin flushed tremendously. "Walk?" he said. "Dig? Shall I?" Dickon's glance at him was delicately cautious. Neither he nor Mary had ever asked if there was anything the matter with his legs. "For sure thou will," he said stoutly. "Thou's got legs of thy own, same as other folks?" Mary was rather frightened until she heard Colin's answer. "Nothing really ails them," he said, "but they are so thin and weak. They shake so that I'm afraid to try and stand on them." Both Mary and Dickon drew a relieved breath. "When thou stops being afraid, thou'lt stand on 'em," Dickon said with renewed cheer, "and thou'lt stop being afraid in a bit." "I shall," said Colin, and he lay still as if he were wondering about things. They were really very quiet for a little while. The sun was dropping lower. It was that hour when everything stills itself, and they really had had a busy and exciting afternoon. Colin looked as if he were resting luxuriously. Even the creatures had ceased moving about and had drawn together and were resting near them. Soot had perched on a low branch and drawn up one leg and dropped the gray film drowsily over his eyes. Mary privately thought he looked as if he might snore in a minute. In the midst of this stillness it was rather startling when Colin half lifted his head and exclaimed in a loud, suddenly alarmed whisper, "Who is that man?" Dickon and Mary scrambled to their feet. "Man?" they both cried in low, quick voices. Colin pointed to the high wall. "Look," he whispered excitedly. "Just look." Mary and Dickon wheeled about and looked. There was Ben Weatherstaff's indignant face glaring at them over the wall from the top of a ladder. He actually shook his fist at Mary. "If I wasn't a bachelder, and thou was a wench of mine," he cried, "I'd give thee a hiding." He mounted another step threateningly, as if it were his energetic intention to jump down and deal with her. But as she came toward him he evidently thought better of it, and stood on the top step of his ladder, shaking his fist down at her. "I never thought much of thee," he harangued. "I couldn't abide thee the first time I set eyes on thee, a scrawny buttermilk faced young besom, allus asking questions and poking their nose where it wasn't wanted. I never knowed how they got so thick with me. If it hadn't 'a' been for the robin, drat him!" "Ben Weatherstaff," called out Mary, finding her breath. She stood below him and called up to him with a sort of gasp, "Ben Weatherstaff, it was the robin who showed me the way." Then it did seem as if Ben really would scramble down on the side of the wall, he was so outraged. "Thou young bad un," he called down at her, "laying the badness on a robin, not but what is impudent enough for anything. Him showing thee the way. Him! That young note." She could see his next words burst out because he was overpowered by curiosity. "However in the world did thou get in?" "It was the robin who showed me the way," she protested obstinately. "He didn't know he was doing it, but he did. And I can't tell you from here while you're shaking your fist at me." He stopped shaking his fist very suddenly at that moment, and his jaw actually dropped as if he stared over her head at something he saw coming over the grass toward him. At the first sound of his torrent of words Colin had been so surprised that he only sat up and listened as if he were spellbound. But in the midst of it he had recovered himself and beckoned imperiously to Dickon. "Wheel me over there," he commanded. "Wheel me quite close and stop right in front of him. And this, if you please." This is what Ben Weatherstaff beheld and which made his jaw drop. A wheeled chair with luxurious cushions and robes, which came toward him looking rather like some sort of state coach, because a young Rajah leaned back in it with royal command in his great black rimmed eyes, and a thin white hand extended haughtily toward him. And it stopped right under Ben Weatherstaff's nose. It was really no wonder his mouth dropped open. "Do you know who I am?" demanded the Rajah. How Ben Weatherstaff stared! His red old eyes fixed themselves on what was before him as if he were seeing a ghost. He gazed and gulped a lump down his throat, and did not say a word. "Do you know who I am?" demanded Colin, still more imperiously. "Answer!" Ben Weatherstaff put his gnarled hand up and passed it over his eyes and over his forehead, and then he did answer in a queer, shaky voice. "Who thou art?" he said. "Ay, that I do. with their mother's eyes staring at me out of that face. Lord knows how they came here, but thou'rt the poor cripple." Colin forgot that he ever had a back. His face flushed scarlet, and he sat bolt upright. "I am not a cripple!" he cried out furiously. "I'm not!" "He's not!" cried Mary, almost shouting up the wall in her fierce indignation. "He's not got a lump as big as a pin. I looked, and there was none there. Not one." Ben Weatherstaff passed his hand over his forehead again, and gazed as if he could never gaze enough. His hands shook, and his mouth shook, and his voice shook. He was an ignorant old man, and a tactless old man, and he could only remember the things he had heard. "Thou hasn't got a crooked back?" he said hoarsely. "No," shouted Colin. "Thou hasn't got crooked legs?" quavered Ben more hoarsely yet. It was too much. The strength which Colin usually threw into his tantrums rushed through him now in a new way. Never yet had he been accused of crooked legs, even in whispers, and the perfectly simple belief in their existence which was revealed by Ben Weatherstaff's voice was more than Rajah Flesh and Blood could endure. His anger and insulted pride made him forget everything but this one moment, and filled him with a power he had never known before, an almost unnatural strength. "Come here!" he shouted to Dickon, and he actually began to tear the coverings off his lower limbs and disentangle himself. "Come here! Come here! This minute!" Dickon was by his side in a second. Mary caught his breath in a short gasp and felt herself turn pale. "He can do it! He can do it! He can do it! He can!" she gabbled over to herself under her breath as fast as ever she could. There was a brief, fierce scramble. The rugs were tossed on the ground. Dickon held Colin's arm. The thin legs were out. The thin feet were on the grass. Colin was standing upright, as straight as an arrow and looking strangely tall, his head thrown back and his strange eyes flashing lightning. "Look at me!" he flung at Ben Weatherstaff. "Just look at me, you! Just look at me!" "He's as straight as I am," cried Dickon. "He's as straight as any lad in Yorkshire." What Ben Weatherstaff did Mary thought queer beyond measure. He choked and gulped, and suddenly tears ran down his weather-wrinkled cheeks as he struck his old hands together. He burst forth. "The lies folk telled, thou'rt as thin as a lath and as white as a wraith, but there's not a knob on thee. Thou'll make a mon yet. God bless thee!" Dickon held Colin's arm strongly, but the boy had not begun to falter. He stood straighter and straighter and looked Ben Weatherstaff in the face. "I am your master," he said, "when my father is away, and you are to obey me. This is my garden. Don't you dare say a word about it. You get down from that ladder and go to the long walk, and Miss Mary will meet you and bring you here. I want to talk to you. We did not want you, but now you will have to be in the secret. Be quick." Ben Weatherstaff's crabbed old face was still wet with that one queer rush of tears. It seemed as if he could not take his eyes from thin, straight Colin standing on his feet with his head thrown back. Lad," he almost whispered. My lad." And then, remembering himself, he suddenly touched his hat, gardener fashion, and said, "Yes, sir. Yes, sir," and obediently disappeared as he descended the ladder. End of Chapter 21. Recording by Ashley Jane. Chapter 22 of The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. When the Sun Went Down. When his head was out of sight, Colin turned to Mary. "Go and meet him," he said, and Mary flew across the grass to the door under the ivy. Dickon was watching him with sharp eyes. There were scarlet spots on his cheeks, and he looked amazing, but he showed no signs of falling. "I can stand it," he said, and his head was still held up, and he said it quite grandly. "I told thee thou could as soon as thou stopped being afraid," answered Dickon, "and thou stopped." "Yes, I stopped," said Colin. Then suddenly he remembered something Mary had said. "Are you making magic?" he said sharply. Dickon's curly mouth spread in a cheerful grin. "Thou's doing magic thyself," he said. "It's same magic as made these here work out o' the earth," and he touched with his thick boot a clump of crocuses in the grass. Colin looked down at them. "Aye," he said slowly, "there couldna be bigger magic than that there. There couldna be." He drew himself up straighter than ever. "I'm going to walk to that tree," he said, pointing to one a few feet away from him. "I'm going to be standing when Weatherstaff comes in. I can rest against a tree if I like. When I want to sit down I will sit down, but not before. Bring a rug from the chair." He walked to the tree, and though Dickon held his arm, he was wonderfully steady. When he stood against the tree trunk, it was not too plain that he supported himself against it, and he still held himself so straight that he looked tall. When Ben Weatherstaff came through the door in the wall, he saw him standing there, and he heard Mary muttering something under her breath. "What art saying?" he asked, rather testily, because he did not want his attention distracted from the long, thin, straight boy figure and proud face. But she did not tell him. What she was saying was this: "You can do it! You can do it! Told you you could! You can do it! You can do it! You can!" She was saying it to Colin because she wanted to make magic, and keep him on his feet looking like that. She could not bear that he should give in before Ben Weatherstaff. He did not give in. She was uplifted by a sudden feeling that he looked quite beautiful in spite of his thinness. He fixed his eyes on Ben Weatherstaff in his funny, imperious way. "Look at me," he commanded. "Look at me all over. Am I a hunchback? Have I got crooked legs?" Ben Weatherstaff had not quite got over his emotion, but he had recovered a little, and answered almost in his usual way. "Not tha," he said. "No to the sort. What's tha been doing with thyself, hiding out of sight and letting folk think thou was a cripple and half-witted?" "Half-witted!" said Colin angrily. "Who thought that?" "Lots of fools," said Ben. "The world's full of jackasses braying, and they never bray nought but lies. What did tha shut yourself up for?" "Everyone thought I was going to die," said Colin shortly. "I'm not." And he said it with such decision, Ben Weatherstaff looked him over, up and down, down and up. "Tha die?" he said with dry exultation. "No to the sort. Tha's got too much pluck in thee. When I seed thee put the legs on the ground in such a hurry, I knowed thou was all right. Sit thee down on the rug a bit, young mester, and give me thy orders." There was a queer mixture of crabbed tenderness and shrewd understanding in his manner. Mary had poured out speech as rapidly as she could as they had come down the long walk. The chief thing to be remembered, she had told him, was that Colin was getting well. Getting well. The garden was doing it. No one would let him remember about having humps and dying. The Rajah condescended to seat himself on a rug under a tree. "What work do you do in the gardens, Weatherstaff?" he inquired. "Anything I'm told to do," answered old Ben. "Anything I'm told to do," answered old Ben. "I'm kep' on by favour, because she liked me." "She?" said Colin. "Thy mother," answered Ben Weatherstaff. "My mother?" said Colin, and he looked about him quietly. This was her garden, wasn't it? Aye, it was that, and Ben Weatherstaff looked about him too. She were main fond of it. "It is my garden now. I am fond of it. I shall come here every day," announced Colin. "But it is to be a secret. My orders are that no one is to know that we come here. Dickon and my cousin have worked and made it come alive. I shall send for you sometimes to help, but you must come when no one can see you." Ben Weatherstaff's face twisted itself in a dry old smile. "I've come here before when no one saw me," he said. "What?" exclaimed Colin. "When? Last time I was here," rubbing his chin and looking round, "was about 2 year ago." "But no one has been in it for 10 years," cried Colin. "There was no door." "I'm no one," said Ben dryly, "and I didn't come through the door. I came over the wall. The rheumatics held me back the last 2 year." "Tha come and did a bit of pruning," cried Dickon. "I couldn't make out how it had been done." "She was so fond of it, she was," said Ben Weatherstaff slowly. "And she was such a pretty young thing. She says to me once, 'Ben,' she says, laughing, 'if ever I'm ill or I go away, you must take care of my roses.' When she did go away, the orders was no one was ever to come nigh. But I come, with grumpy obstinacy. Over the wall I come, until the rheumatics stopped me. And I did a bit of work once a year. She had gave her order first." "It wouldn't have been as wick as it is if tha hadn't done it," said Dickon. "I did wonder." "I'm glad you did it, Weatherstaff," said Colin. "You know how to keep the secret." I'll know, sir," answered Ben, "and it'll be easier for a man with rheumatics to come in at the door." On the grass near the tree Mary had dropped her trowel. Colin stretched out his hand and took it up. An odd expression came into his face, and he began to scratch at the earth. His thin hand was weak enough, but presently, as they watched him, Mary was quite breathless with interest, he drove the end of the trowel into the soil and turned some over. "You can do it, you can," said Mary to herself. "I tell you, you can." Dickon's round eyes were full of eager curiousness, but he said not a word. Ben Weatherstaff looked on with interested face. Colin persevered. After he had turned a few trowelfuls of soil, he spoke exultantly to Dickon in his best Yorkshire. "Tha said they'd have me walkin' about here same as other folk, and tha said they'd have me diggin'. I thought tha was just lyin' to please me. This is only the first day, and I've walked, and here I am diggin'." Ben Weatherstaff's mouth fell open again when he heard him, but he ended up chuckling. He said, "that sounds as if tha'd got wits enough. Tha'rt a Yorkshire lad for sure, and tha'rt diggin' too. How'd thou like to plant a bit o' something? I can get thee a rose in a pot." "Go and get it," said Colin, digging excitedly. "Quick, quick!" It was done quickly enough indeed. Ben Weatherstaff went his way forgetting rheumatics. Dickon took his spade and dug the hole deeper and wider than a new digger with thin white hands could make it. Mary slipped out to run and bring back a watering can. When Dickon had deepened the hole, Colin went on turning the soft earth over and over. He looked up at the sky, flushed and glowing with the strange new exercise, slight as it was. "I want to do it before the sun goes quite down," he said. Mary thought that perhaps the sun held back a few minutes just on purpose. Ben Weatherstaff brought the roses in its pots from the greenhouse. He hobbled over the grass as fast as he could. He had begun to be excited too. He knelt down by the hole and broke the pot from the mould. "Here, lad," he said, handing the plant to Colin. "Set it in the earth thyself, same as the king does when he goes to a new place." The thin white hands shook a little, and Colin's flush grew deeper as he settled the rose in the mould and held it while old Ben made firm the earth. It was filled in and pressed down and made steady. Mary was leaning forward on her hands and knees. Soot had flown down and marched forward to see what was being done. Nut and Shell chattered about it from a cherry tree. "It's planted," said Colin at last, "and the sun is only slipping over the edge. Help me up, Dickon. I want to be standing when it goes. That's part of the magic." And Dickon helped him, and the magic, or whatever it was, so gave him strength, and when the sun did slip over the edge and end the strange lovely afternoon for them there, he actually stood on his 2 feet, laughing. End of chapter 22. Recording by Ashley Jane.